Tim, so great to have you on Perko's podcast, mate. Thank you so much for the gift of your time. Thanks for having this conversation with me. How are you doing today?
Jace, thanks for having us on. Really appreciate it. Yeah, doing well. It's a sunny morning, but cold in Brisbane, Queensland. But it's good. So thanks for having us on. Look forward to it.
Yeah, no, I'm thrilled that we actually are doing this via Zoom, but we don't live that far away from each other. Probably only about 45 minutes or so from each other. But it is a chilly start to the day in Queensland, which is unusual for us. When I moved to Queensland to get out of the cold of Colorado in the United States, and it's not working out for me this morning, but that's okay. Hey, mate.
Queensland winters are just beautiful normally, but it's just a bit of a chilly day.
They are spectacular. I shouldn't be complaining, that's for sure. Hey, I'm going to dive into a short little series of questions, mate, for people to get to know you.
Yep.
We have people that listen to the podcast literally from around the world, people in Europe and South America, North America, here in Australia, obviously, and even in Asia. And so I would love for you to share in just a moment a little bit of your story, because I think people are going to be familiar with one of the organizations you've worked with, Compassion International, but may not be as familiar with your story. But I'd love for them to hear a little bit of that. But before we get to that, we're just going to get to know you a little bit through some of your preferences. So I've got a short list of questions that I want to ask you, either or, and you just tell us what first comes to mind. So here's the first one. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Okay. You're a big coffee fan, aren't you?
I do enjoy a good coffee.
Yeah. That's great. Apple or PC?
Apple. At the moment, Apple.
I knew we could be good friends, that's for sure. Beaches or mountains, mate?
Beaches.
Okay. You live in a good spot for that, that's for sure.
Yeah, right. It's good. Not too far away.
Yeah. Dogs or cats?
Oh, dogs.
Yeah.
Please,
okay.
dogs.
Yeah. Okay. That one always, I find that one's always a little bit polarizing, that's for sure.
That's right. I'm sure it is.
Netflix or YouTube?
Oh, that's a hard one. Probably Netflix.
Okay. Call or text?
Call.
Okay. Yep. Podcast or music?
Podcast.
Yeah, that's a great response.
Yeah, that's a good answer, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Sometimes I get guests who say music. I'm like, wait a second, you're not helping the cause here. What about when it comes to food? Are you a hamburger or a taco guy?
Look, there's not much food I don't like, but I'd probably go with hamburger.
Okay. Yeah. What's your favorite? You have a favorite hamburger joint here in Brisbane?
There's a couple. Grill's not bad, but you can get some local places that really build it up well.
Yeah.
Too well.
A good Aussie burger with the lot. That's
Absolutely
not a bad way
to go. Hard to beat.
Some beetroot and some egg and some pineapple.
Dill pickles, the lot.
Oh, put it all on. Love it. Passenger or driver, mate?
Better driver, I think.
Okay. And then when you go to the...
Passengers may not agree, but I feel better driving.
We won't ask your wife that question. Yeah.
No, it's a good question. That's good.
What about when you go to the movies? Are you a lollies guy or a popcorn guy?
No, I'm a lollies. Don't really like popcorn, but I'm a lollies man.
Yeah. Okay. Saver or spender?
Oh, gee, I think I'm probably a spender, which is just as well my wife's a saver, but I'm a spender, I think.
Yeah, okay. I find it interesting that somehow we get paired up with somebody that helps to balance us out.
Just as well.
Yeah, exactly. What about shopping? When it comes to shopping, rather go in the store or online?
No, I'd rather go in the store, I think.
Okay. And then workplace, would you rather work alone or on a team?
I'd rather work on a team, but I do enjoy time alone, but I'd rather work on something on a team.
Okay. And then the one that everybody just wonders about, I'm sure, when it comes to toilet paper, are you an over or an under guy?
Oh, I'm an under guy. No, I'm an under guy. That's a deal breaker.
It's a deal breaker. You got to make sure that toilet roll is put on correctly. Right. That's awesome. Well, Tim, I know there are many people listening that probably are familiar with who you are and maybe a little bit of your story because of your work with Compassion here in Australia. But I would love it, mate, if you would just fill in for those that maybe are not as familiar with your story. Maybe just fill us in on your ministry experience over the years here in Australia. You've been in churches, you've been in not-for-profit world, you've even lectured at colleges, that sort of thing. And I couldn't believe it when we first met that I found out that we have the same hometown, like literally the same hometown back in South Australia in Adelaide. So just give us a brief overview of who Tim Hanna is and how God has, kind of allowed your journey to develop.
Yeah, well, let me start there. I mean, I came out to Australia when I was 9 as a migrant with my family. I was 9 years of age, born in Ireland, Belfast, Northern Ireland, and we grew up in Adelaide, and particularly in Elizabeth, which is a migrant city. It was set up for migrants, basically. And so grew up. There's a pretty tough place. Went to primary school, high school there. My family had no connection with church, really. We nominally Protestant. We come from Ireland, either Catholic or Protestant. Nominally Protestant, but nobody practiced. And so we had no connection with church. Grew up, high school, went to university, studied economics, met my wife at university.
Okay.
And so we married fairly young. I was 20, she was 18.
Wow.
So my kids don't even think about that early, but we did. And then after a couple of years marriage, as I said, we didn't have any background. We just started to get a bit restless, and my wife particularly first, but then myself saying there's got to be something more. So started to explore Christian faith, and we both gave our lives to the Lord 2 years after we were married, in the same week, but at different times, for which I'm extremely grateful.
Yeah.
And then we just soaked it up, really. We started going to a little local church near where we were, the Elizabeth Church of Christ, and that was terrific. And people loved us and cared for us, and we were the youngest couple there, and it was just a great experience. A couple of years after that, I just felt I didn't know enough, and I was helping lead a youth group, and there were kids in that youth group who, from church families, knew a lot more than I did about the Bible. So I was going to go to Bible college for a year.
Yeah.
So I went to the Church of Christ College in Melbourne. We moved across with our family, and I studied there, thinking initially I was going to go for a year and go back to that church, but I did the whole 4-year course, did a theology degree, and had my first ministry in a local church in Perth, a place called Kalamunda Church of Christ, in the hillside suburb of Perth, which was fantastic. Was there for 8 years.
Okay.
And then I taught in the Church of Christ College in Sydney for a couple of years, in particularly in practical theology, leadership, preaching, that sort of stuff. Then I had the call of the wild back to local church ministry again. I pastored a church in Berwick, Victoria.
Okay.
There for 5 years, and again went back and taught at the same college. The principal there's a great friend, and he invited me back, and I went back for another couple of years, and then moved from New South Wales, where I was then, to Queensland, changed states, changed denominations. Pastored a church called Gateway Baptist Church in Brisbane for 10 and a half years, and then left there after 10 and a half years. Great, just felt, it was time to move. Didn't know where. It's the first time I've ever left somewhere without knowing where I was going.
Wow.
That was kind of both freeing and nerve-wracking at the same time. And then Compassion came along and offered me a new role in terms of church direction, church leadership within Compassion. I did that for a year and a half, and then left because I was still living in Brisbane, trying to work in Newcastle. That was difficult. So I left for a year and a bit left, and led up Willow Creek Australia for a year. I was on the board there, and they asked me to lead that for a year. So I did, and then came back in as the CEO of Compassion. So the last 10 and a half years, been with Compassion. And it was like a convergence role for me, the gospel, the church, the poor, all in one role, which I absolutely loved. And I kind of retired from that in February this year. So here I am. And that's a thumbnail sketch of Tim Hanna, the little Irish boy.
I love it. And you, Tim, you got out just in time for COVID to hit. Wow, unbelievable timing.
I know, and to be honest with you, I felt a bit guilty about that to start with. And
did you? Okay.
I mean, it's the right timing for me. I just knew it was the right timing to move, but I did feel a bit bad about it for a start. And I got a good team there, so that's great.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Listen, mate, this the podcast is all about helping people reach their goals, personal, professional, spiritual goals, strategic goals. But at the same time, not losing their souls. The concept there is that a lot of people have reached many goals over the years, but in the meantime, they lost their soul. And so perhaps, did they really reach any goals at all if they lost their soul? What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? What's the worth of your soul? So I would love, for the beginning of the conversation, if you would just focus a little bit on your time in churches, not-for-profit organizations, and leadership roles, to just maybe unpack some of the tools that you've come across that have helped organizations identify their goals, their strategic goals, and perhaps then some of the strategies that you've seen to be effective in reaching those goals, if you have any tools or ideas that come to mind?
Yeah, look, I think even before your goal, you need to look at your why, and your why can be your first and foremost goal. So why do I exist? Why does this organization exist? Why does this church exist? It was a bit easier with compassion because it was a very simple why. We wanted to release children from poverty in Jesus' name. That was it. But with local churches, it can be a bit more difficult because it's not a question of why does the church exist, because you can look at this great scriptural background for that. But why does your church exist? So you've got to get that why into place before you actually start to look at KPI goals, because you have to come back to why all the time. When you come to a challenge or a crisis, for example, like now, you have to come back to the why, because there's so many things to do and so many other causes and so many other bits to fill in. So I think the why is really important, and then set some goals. And I think the ways to keep those at the forefront, that's important with an organization or a church staff or a church congregation, to keep those things at the forefront. So you've got to communicate the why continually.
Yes.
Sometimes to the point where you feel sick of communicating it, because you know it well. At that point of time, you're probably just getting to the right level. When you're sick of it, probably other people need to hear it. And so that's really important. And to make the why simple, I don't mean simplistic, but simple. Yeah. Because the more complex you make your why, the more difficult it is. Simplicity and passion are so connected together, but complexity kills passion. Yeah. And the difficulty is you don't drift into simplicity, you tend to drift into complexity. So you've got to be intentional about the why. So it's communicating it, telling good stories about why your why matters and things that have happened out of your why. So I would go to that place and say, we've got to communicate well, got to tell the stories, you've got to keep it before people. Even if you know it well, you've still got to keep it out there.
Yeah, no, that's great, Tim. So really starting with your why, and then one of the things that you mentioned that I think is so incredibly important is keeping it simple, but then keeping it in front of people as well constantly, and creative ways to do that through storytelling and other things than just, simply stating why we exist every time you get up in front of everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything that you have found to be helpful then when organizations are creating their goals, as far as strategies that actually help them to achieve those things? Is there anything you found over the years that you found uniquely helpful?
Look, I think it's easier to keep your why clear if you've got a good culture in the organization.
Yep.
So I think culture's gold. I think if you can build good cultural values, this is how we're going to, and cultural values are not just about them, well, they're not about the organization's aim, that's out there, but cultural values are about how we're going to operate together.
Yeah.
And to develop cultural values that we're all in this together. We want to do it. So when the why is continually communicated, we're going to do that together. We're aligned well. So I think, leadership, culture, alignment, good teams, all on the same page. They're kind of the framework, I think, for any church, for any organization, not for profit or even business. I think that healthy framework will make a difference. And I think as a leader, you have to be on the page too. You have to be modeling what we're about and what the goals are, what the why is, how it fits in with your own why. And I think that's important to make sure you're growing as a leader in that space.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about that, Tim, because I think that is absolutely critical. Most of us as leaders are not just leading an organization, but we're oftentimes we have to lead ourselves first before we can lead an organization. Quite frankly, if we're not leading ourselves well, then it's impossible for us to lead an organization or to lead others well. And I find that is particularly important in the framework or in the structure of our homes. So leading ourselves well, but leading our families well. You've got a large family. Congratulations, by the way, 9 kids, 24 grandkids. That's impressive in and of itself. That's an accomplishment.
There's another church.
That's it. You've already planted a church. So, So talk to us though about how did you see that type of thing, like finding your why, play out for you personally, but also in the context of your family?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I grabbed it early on in ministry. You know, I'm a few years on now, and I've probably only more recently had understood how I operate best and have words to articulate it best. Whereas I think I did it then, but didn't know why I did what I did. And
Yeah.
so discovering your own particular why and your own particular calling is really important. In terms of family, I'm not sure, to be very honest. I'd love to be able to say I had that nailed right from the beginning and I did it well and I was great. But I probably overbalanced in terms of ministry and relied on my wife overly, and she
Yeah.
was very capable. And the difficulty with capable people, sometimes we put even more responsibility than we
Yeah.
should. So I probably put more onto her and focused on church, and you know it's worked okay. But yeah, when I think about it, I wasn't fair for her. So
Yeah.
but you know we got there. I think discovering your own why and your own purpose is again gold. It's really important. I think it's not easy to do that. I think I've probably in more recent years been able to articulate what my purpose, what my calling is, and
Yes.
and even to be able to carry that out in your family. So that's an important part. You can't separate the two really. As we sometimes talk about work-life balance as if it's hours here and hours there.
Yeah.
I've found it's much better to think in terms of seasons and rhythms. Uh,
Okay.
where does the focus need to be right now?
Yeah. Tim, unpack that concept that you just talked about, seasons and rhythms, a little bit. Maybe what are some practical ways you've seen that play out? Because I agree with you. There is this misconception out there that you just count up, 20 hours here and 20 hours there,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you've got work-life balance or something. But this idea of seasons and rhythms, I think that's really important. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, look, I think the minute you start counting, watching the clock and counting down the hours here, there, and doing my job here, and then doing my role here, and you know my own personal space that needs time. I think once you do that, you're kind of so pulled apart, and whereas we're whole beings, and so my whole being is is ministry, it's family, it's personal time, it's a whole bunch, recreational time, it's all of that. And so it's important to be able to see the times and the seasons. The scriptures talk about watch the times and the seasons, because it could be a time which is very um, intense for the church. Got through the season. It's a tough season. It's hard. So I may have to actually emphasize more time in that space. But it
Yeah.
could be a time where there is, and you trust your family to understand that you can't play it too far, or else it just
Yeah.
goes on forever.
Yeah.
But I think there's also times when there's family needs, and then it could be sickness, or it could be a need or some sort in your family, and you realize that's what my priority needs to be in the next 48 hours, 24, and you have to do that. And we have to understand ourselves as integral human beings rather than just compartmentalized human beings. So it's really crucial to understand the seasons and to build rhythm into your life. And my rhythm might need to be, I really need to be here present for this, crucial time where I would normally
Yeah.
not be, whether it's
Yeah.
church or family or wherever. And I think it's discovering that and being okay with that in yourself, and those who work around you being okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to us, Tim, a little bit about leadership in an organization. I know, most organizations have an org chart that has a CEO at the top and, some vice presidents or some directors of different departments or divisions, and then managers under them, and so on and so forth. In Mark 10, Jesus called us to a different style of leadership, which some people would refer to that first style of an org chart as kind of a top-down leadership. And
Yeah.
Jesus
Yeah.
introduced his followers to this idea of, if you want to be first, you need to be last. If you want to be the leader, you need to serve. And some people have referred to that as kind of a bottom-up leadership. From my little bit of time being around you, I've sensed that you believe in servant leadership, but you also not just believe in it, it's something that you try to practice as well. Could you maybe share from your time at Compassion or even time in local church ministry some practical ways you've seen servant leadership actually play itself out in an organization.
Yeah, look, I think that the day and time of an autocratic leader is probably diminishing greatly. The person who stands at the front and says, I know it all, let's go. People sometimes just feel in that sort of leadership that they are fodder for one person's vision. And you don't want that. You want people to, and when stuff is imposed upon people, you get compliance, but when people are part of it, you get ownership. And in any organization or church or not-for-profit, you want people to own the why, not just comply with it and feel fodder. So I think that's crucial. I think Jesus is a great model for that. So I would want to engage people right at the beginning in their cultural values. So it's not like here's how we're going to live together. Get it? If you don't do it, you're in trouble. It's how do we together dilute between us all how we're going to live. What are the values we're going to have? And I think that's really important. I think the other thing is being other-centered. So I genuinely believe that I wanted people who worked at Compassion. I didn't know whether they were there for 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, 16 years. I wanted them to leave a bigger person than when they started. So I wanted them to be a bigger person of themselves, to grow. And I think people look to a leader and they kind of decide, does this person have more for me than they want from me? And I think that's a question to ask. Does this leader want some stuff from me, or do they have they got something for me? And I think servant leadership really means it's other centered. I want you to be the best version of you can be, and you've got to obviously put time and effort and into that as well. So I think servant leadership is crucial, but it doesn't take away from having to make tough decisions. It doesn't make away from having to make hard calls and hard conversations. But I think it's other centered. And the other thing is, I think when you're getting people around you, one of the things I think is crucial is to get people to do the role you want them to do better than you would do it yourself. Yeah. So you don't want people who just subservient to you in their abilities and capacities, so that you're always looking over their shoulder and looking over their back to see if they're doing it right. I want people in an executive team, for example, who will do their job better than I would do their job. Yeah. And that way, you have to be a servant to them. You have to resource them because they're better at it than you are. So there's a whole bunch of things, I think, which feed into that.
Yeah. I'm so grateful early on in my years of leadership, I had somebody in maybe not the kindest of ways, but they identified to me, Perko, they were like, you're really good at probably 2 or 3 things. And you're going to need to build a team around you of people that are far better at these other areas than you are. And that has stuck with me for a long, long period of time. But Tim, I think it's so valuable what you said, that if you can be others centered and others focused by having something that you want for them, rather than just knowing what you want from them, I think that's so valuable as kind of the baseline of an others-centered mindset is, what do I want for this person, and make that greater than anything that I could get from them.
Well, people pick that up like that. They know that straight away.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tim, we mentioned just a minute ago that you have a large family. You've got nine kids, 24 grandkids. Congratulations. Yep. That's fantastic. So far, there could be more on the way, which is fantastic. What are some of the rhythms? Because you've mentioned already that you didn't always get it right when it came to the balance of ministry and a large family, but yet I'm sure over the years you and Chris developed at least some habits, some rhythms, some practices to try and maintain a healthy family relationship. What are some of the top maybe 2 or 3 things that you and Chris focused on that you feel like were really helpful with your family?
Yeah, look, as I said before, I think my wife was amazing. She was much better at this than I was, and she had the ability to create things that were family memories, things that were, that we would remember forever, different little bits and pieces. But the one thing I did throughout the years, which I probably stumbled across rather than was wonderfully intentional, and it probably suited me as well. But every Thursday night, I would take one of my kids out for dinner, just me and that one. We've got six daughters, 3 sons. And we would just go to a local food court in a shopping centre. And they started at the age of 2 and finished when they left home, basically. And
wow.
So as a 2-year-old, all they're doing is sitting, watching around with people and see what they're doing. But it was still time with Dad. As they got up into teenage years, it was more, how you going? How's life? You know, it was more like that. So that was one very practical thing that I maintained. It was almost, had to be an absolute emergency not to do that. Now I'm glad I did that, because there were other times I was a bit haphazard and that. So we created memories. We did those sort of things. We would use events to be and see what is God saying in an event. So we would be able to see this happen to us. What might that be saying about faith or life? So we would use incidental events to actually be faith stirring for our family, and that was a good thing too. So just a couple of things, but as I said, my wife was much better at creating memories and doing things, and much more creative and artistic and stuff with the kids, and that was great.
Yeah, I love that, the idea of small deposits over a long period of time add up to a very large investment. So the idea of that, I love the food court on Thursday night, like
it was great.
The classic late night shopping in Australia, heading to the food court on a Thursday night. And
absolutely.
So good.
The typically for my kids is they had to wait 9 weeks to get the next one. That was the problem.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So really you were basically only doing it about once a quarter with each kid, it sounds like.
Absolutely. But I was doing it every week.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I love that. That's such a practical thing.
Yeah, it's just very good.
That you can do. Tim, I would love to go back to a conversation that you and I had a little while ago. You said something in the conversation that has really stuck with me, and I'd love for you to unpack it a little bit. You've worked in a number of different organizations over the years, but you have sensed that God gave you a calling, but he gave you different assignments for that calling. And that concept just stuck with me ever since our conversation together. Could you maybe unpack a little bit for our listeners what you mean by that, a irrevocable calling on your life, but multiple assignments throughout your life, and what that has looked like for you?
Yeah, look, I found it incredibly helpful to make that distinction for me personally. It's just been really, really good, because I think sometimes we talk about, I'm in this role, so that's my calling. I'm in this role, that's my calling. And it gets messy, I think, sometimes if that particular role comes to an end, and what's happened? Have I lost my calling? I just think with any role you're in, there's a bigger calling. There's something above that. There's a banner above that the way God has wired you, the way God has equipped you, and the passions, the skills, the gifts he's given you to work in your life. And then you have assignments beyond it. Let me give you an illustration from my own life, I guess. And look, I'm not sure I understood this early on in my ministry. When I look back, I say, aha, that's what's happened. But again, I've only had probably the words to articulate this in more recent years. But I, for me personally, I've come to realize that my calling, what God has wired me for, is to bring good health, good culture, and flourishing to people, organizations, churches where I've been.
Yes.
And that's generally been in a situation where that's been required for a period of time. And that's my overall. Now I've had a number of 6 or 7 assignments, 3 local churches, college, compassion, and now what I'm doing now. And they've all fitted under that banner, but they've been different assignments. So if I move assignments, I've not lost my calling. The Apostle Paul says that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Now, if your calling's tied up with an assignment and you lose that assignment for whatever reason, then you've got to say, well, is it irrevocable or not? Whereas if you see it as a bigger banner above that, then you never lose your calling. You might change your assignment. That's been very, very helpful, because it means you can leave well, because you're not losing your calling. You're just moving assignments, and it can do all that. The tricky thing, I think, is discovering personally, what is your calling? That's the tricky thing.
I was going to ask you, because you said that in the early days you wouldn't have been able to articulate that. and
Yeah.
you wouldn't have necessarily been able to see it. What are some practical ways, Tim, that you've seen that calling be identified maybe in these later years where you've been able to say, hey, it was maybe somebody else identifying it or you identifying it? What does that look like?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of questions I think that give you a start or a lead in or a hint to that. So what do I love doing is one. Secondly, what am I good at doing?
Yeah.
And thirdly, another question I think this is really important. What do trusted others recognize that I love doing and I'm good at doing? So not just what do I love doing, what am I good at doing, but what do trusted others recognize? And I think that gives you the beginning point of discovering your personal why, your personal calling, and then you're able to say, well, that assignment wouldn't fit with that. We'd be able to, no, that assignment wouldn't fit with that, or that wouldn't work. Or you can do things you can take assignments that fit in with your calling, and there'll be joy most of the time, not all the time, joy, delight, fulfillment. Because if you're doing assignments that are contrary to your calling, there's this internal dissonance in your own life where you think, oh, I'm not in a space where I really flourish. I'm not on my sweet spot. And so I think ask those three questions to start with, and go back even further. Love God, love people. Is that what I'm in? That's Jesus was pretty clear about that.
Yes.
Start with there, but it's what do others and I say are my sweet spots?
Yeah. So really you're saying, Tim, start off with what do you love doing?
Yep.
What are you good at?
Yep.
And then what do others say it's obvious you're good at this and that you love doing it?
That's right. That's a starting point. Yep.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic.
And I'd say work hard to articulate it in your own language so that it's crystal clear in your own thinking.
Yeah.
Don't be fuzzy about it. Be crystal clear.
So Tim, you've had this clear calling as you look back now over your life to come into organizations, and I don't want to, throw anyone under the bus, but maybe you said, I've been called into organizations that perhaps weren't as healthy as they possibly could be. Potentially, there was some health potential there for them to gain. When you come into those kinds of organizations, and I think you've already touched on this a little bit, but I'd love for you to just articulate in the beginning of those assignments, what were maybe some of the top two or three things that you looked for and began to work on immediately to help maybe turn the tide or to turn the ship, so to speak, towards more of a healthy organization?
Yeah, that's a great question because that's a crucial question. And some of those, assignments I went into and I thought, I know I'm meant to be here, but I've got no idea where to go.
Yeah.
So particularly in the early days, but I think I'd always start with developing culture and finding out what the culture of the organization is to start with. So for example, they've all been, they're not necessarily not broken organizations. They've just been through a period of maybe difficulty, or a couple of the churches were actually quite broken in terms of splits or things that had happened.
Yes.
But I know coming into Compassion is a great organisation, and it's been going since 1952, and a bit later than that in Australia. But you don't want to muck it up. So where do you start? But I just got together the staff and said, okay, you tell me what it's like coming to work here. It's not about our why, because our why is releasing children from poverty. We don't want to change that.
That's set.
You tell me what it's like working here, things that you would like to change, and tell me things that are not in existence that you would want to put into make happen. So out of that, I worked through that with my HR manager and director, and we distilled ultimately 5 values that we think we need to work together. And the great thing is they were decided by people. They weren't decided by me. This is what we all said, so we all live it. So I gauge the culture and what's happening with the culture, and what is it like and what does it need to start with. And the change of culture takes some years, so it's not like not like today we need to decide this and tomorrow it happens. The other thing is I get people in around me in the team that I work most closely with who are on the same page, who are not going to gild the lily. They're not going to make you believe it's all fantastic and it's terrific. They're going to be honest about where it's at. Yeah. And those two things of culture and the leadership alignment, I think are crucial in any organization. And that's where I would start, even when you don't know what to start. How to start.
No, it's fantastic. You mentioned there, Tim, that it's not a short race. It's a long-term
Yeah.
assignment as far as developing or changing culture. How would you describe pace in that process? Like, what would you describe as far as a healthy pace in an organization if you're a leader trying to bring health to the culture?
Yeah, look, I would say make sure you get those things happening first. So don't rush culture. Don't
Okay.
rush trying to, well, we've had these meetings, now we're all together. Let's go and strategize the next 5 years.
Yep.
I would say let's make sure that gets embedded first. And culture probably takes a good, I think, 4 to 6 years to really fully embed in an organization or a
Yeah.
church.
Okay.
So you can't put everything else on hold for that time, but you've got to see how there's progress happening, and you sort of cast vision to work with that progress. Like if
Yes.
you've just got somewhere that's been broken, a bit broken, and you say, we've got our values now, we're right. Now we're going to build a auditorium for 20,000 people, and you've
Yes.
got still a fair bit of brokenness there. That's going to fall in a heap, just as sure as you know it. Whereas
Yeah.
you sort of build the vision according to where the health of where people are at, and health ultimately brings growth. So that's an important sort of biological
Yeah.
mandate. So
Yeah.
I would say it does take to embed a good number of years, four to
Yeah.
six, and it's not just culture's a funny thing. It's not just what you build; it's what you allow. So, for example, you might say, "I want a culture of healthy conversations, but I allow gossip," and then
Yeah.
you wonder why your culture doesn't get better, because it's not just about what you build; it's what you allow, and those
Yeah.
things have to mesh together. So, yeah,
Yeah, your aspirations and your reality have to start to meet at
absolutely
some point, or else you will never get to what you aspire to.
right.
So, Tim, we are on this call primarily because you were quoted from a previous podcast guest that I had, a mutual friend of ours, Mark McCrindle, was on the podcast a few months back now, and he mentioned something when I asked him about this issue of soul care, because our podcast has a focus of not just helping leaders reach their goals, but also maintaining a healthy soul. So when I asked Mark to share with me some of the practices that he uses to maintain a healthy soul, he actually quoted you as you were exiting compassion. You said this: find whatever feeds your soul and do lots of it. I
Mm.
would love to know, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know, what is it that feeds your soul, and what do you do a lot of because of that?
Yeah, look, I think soul care is crucial. Your soul, I would define as that part of you which is the purest relationship you have with God.
Yeah.
God knows you before you were conceived. He says, I knew you before you were in your mother's womb. So this is a strange thing to say, maybe, but existence occurs before conception for us,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is kind of, when you think about it, existence to God, because God knew us.
Yes.
And it's kind of our soul that he knew. I think that it's the basic part of us. And then from conception onwards, we get all these tags and labels. We're the most labeled generation ever. We hashtag
Yeah.
everything. So you get all these taintings and expectations, and your own as well as other people's, and that forms a different part of you that can get tainted and sort of mixed up. So that part of you which God knew best is your soul. So you've got to work out what is it that feeds that relationship with God more than anything.
Yeah.
And it could be music, it could be nature, it could be walking, it could be solitude, it could be a hobby, it could be a whole bunch of things. Just find out where you feel most attuned to God. It's a little bit like, I don't know if you remember seeing the movie Chariots of Fire, where Eric Liddell,
Yes.
made that statement. So when I run, I feel God's pleasure. Whatever it
Yeah.
is where you just feel God's pleasure, do lots of it. So for me personally, I walk and pray better than I sit and pray. So I've got
Yeah.
to realize that it's not right or wrong. I walk and pray better than I sit and pray. I love being in a coffee shop with a pen and a piece of paper,
Mm.
and I think and I write and I observe and I just make some comment, to myself, and I might be preparing something. So that sort of stuff is important. With scripture, I find personally that I want to explore a passage rather than just read a certain number of chapters every day, get through a book. I
Yes.
find I could be on the same passage of scripture for a couple of weeks, just
Yeah.
trying to, what is this really saying to me, and what's it saying to us, and what am I? So it's whatever it is that feeds your soul. It could be listening to music. It could be, a hobby where you just feel God is with you in that particular moment. So I think it's whatever feeds your soul. And we're all unique. So I think the trouble comes when we try to formularize what works best for us.
Yeah.
And sometimes we do that, and it doesn't work it works for you, doesn't work for someone else,
Yeah.
or it works for someone else, doesn't work for you, and you feel bad about it. But feel free enough in your faith to discover what it is that gets you that closeness to God, and do lots of it.
Yeah. And it really, you've touched on something there, Tim, that I think is important to understand, that you are unique. God has made you unique, and he knows your existence as you described it from the beginning of time. And so that your soul care is going to look different to somebody else's. And I
Yep.
think the moment that we try to perhaps put into practice what worked for somebody else, or even impose what has worked for us onto somebody else, that's when we maybe begin to go down a road towards legalism, where we think that the practice is going to be the thing that feeds our soul, when it's actually the person of God himself is who's going to feed our soul, not the practice. Yeah.
There are
So
some practices that we almost make the 11th commandment. You must do this, you must do this, you must do this. But work out how you develop your closeness with God, and do lots of that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So Tim, you've wrapped up at Compassion recently. You've moved into a new season of ministry. I would love for you just to share with our listeners what you're currently working on, the organization that you're working with now that helps to kind of facilitate some of that. And then I'm going to ask you at the end of all of that, how can people get in touch with you if they'd like to connect with you?
Sure. So, when I finished the Compassion, consistent with my calling, I felt I needed to feed back in and give help where I can. So I'm doing some coaching and consulting, some mentoring with leaders, church leaders primarily, but leaders, not-for-profit leaders, and some organizational leaders. And I'm doing that and loving it. I'm doing some, I was planning to do that anyway, but then I'm now working 3 days a week with an organization called Partners in Ministry, which has the same philosophy, the same desire to build into leaders, to build, coach, consult with leaders and churches and their teams, and to make a difference and build into the kingdom. So I love that. And so Partners in Ministry is what I do for most of the time, and I still do a little bit of stuff from my own, what I plan to do anyway. But it's very similar, and I'm just loving doing it and catching up. And so Partners in Ministry initially started a few years ago, but primarily in Sydney and Victoria, and now they've expanded into Queensland, wanting me to lead the work up here, and then also to added to the teams in Victoria and New South Wales and in South Australia. So eventually wanting to sort of say, we want to help wherever we can, and help leaders. Leading a church, leading an organization is a tough gig, and we want to make it, we want to get alongside you and help you and support you. So love to help any way we can.
Yeah. Well, I've found over the years that having coaches and mentors in my own life has been incredibly valuable. And so I would just love to highly recommend anyone that's listening to the podcast, if you haven't had a coach or a mentor involved in your ministry and in your leadership, highly recommend that they explore that option wherever they're listening from. But certainly if they're in Australia, I think Partners in Ministry would be an excellent option to look at. And you guys have a website. I think it's partnersinministry.org or .com.au.
.org, yeah.
.org, yep. And then how would people get in touch with you, Tim? What's the best way to connect with you if they wanted to catch up or follow up on this conversation in some way?
Sure, a number of ways, but I don't confuse it. But you could either do that through Partners in Ministry. Tim Hanna, Tim.Hanna at partnersinministry.com.
Yep.
Or I've got my own, and also on my own email, tim@timhanna.com.au.
Yep.
So I've got a
Yep.
website. If you connect me there, I'll connect you. We'll connect with Partners in Ministry as well. So
Yeah.
I've got a little vlog and blog that I do there each fortnight, which I quite enjoy, and
Yeah.
just something that's erupted out of COVID.
Yep.
So stuff there you'll get to me on the website or
Yeah.
timhanna.com.au or through
Yep.
Partners in Ministry.
Yeah, and you've actually got a lot of content on your website. I've been on your website, timhanna.com.au. Also, lots about what you're doing as far as helping develop organizational culture, mentoring, coaching, even some of the public speaking that you do for churches and organizations as well. All that information's on your website. So
Sure.
I'd love for people to be able to connect with you in that way. Tim, is there anything else that you just feel that if a leader is going to be leading especially a Christian organization, but even if it's, a for-profit business or whatever that's not overtly Christian, is there anything else that you think, man, this is a part of a leader's DNA that just can't be missed?
Yeah, look, I think sometimes we want to be the best we can in the organisation, which is our assignment at the moment. That's great. So that becomes the focus. But I would say any leader in the kingdom of God needs to have an expanded view of the kingdom to the point where I think you need to have a heart for the lost, the broken, and the poor. I think that's Jesus' call in the synagogue in his hometown. Bring good news to the poor and recovery of sight to the blind. So I think I would say to any leader that you will become more full-orbed if you have an expansive heart and an expansive interest in the broken and lost. Go and visit people. Go and visit places that you never thought you would. Go and visit communities that are broken and poor in your country or beyond other countries, and you will be a much more well-rounded person for the ministry you have. So I think that's the area I'd say make sure compassion helped me with that, obviously, and you realize, wow, there's a wide world out there. Not everyone lives like me. Not everyone is in my space, and not everyone would fit into the kind of world that I'm doing. It can become very small unless you see a wider view of the kingdom.
Yeah. So really, it's that broader view of not becoming so focused on just the assignment that God has given you, but have a fuller understanding of what God is doing around the world, and
Absolutely.
with a bit of an emphasis on that areas of brokenness and poverty around the world to make you a more full leader. Yeah. It's fantastic. Cool. Tim, it's been such a pleasure, mate. Thank you so much for joining us and to carve out an hour or so of your time to be on the podcast. Really appreciate it, mate.
Jason, thanks for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. It's been fun.